What drives a man already drowning in wealth to seek glory soaked in blood? For Marcus, Licinius Crassus known as the richest man in Rome, the answer was simple: power that could match his peers, Julius Caesar and Pompey Magnus. Crassus was a member of the First Triumvirate. Yet unlike Caesar's military conquests in Gaul or Pompey's victories in the East, his legacy remained tied to money, not military greatness. That, in Rome, was a fatal imbalance. By 54 BCE, Crassus had decided to change that. At the age of 60, he set his sights on Rome's powerful eastern rival. Located in modern-day Iran and Iraq, the Parthian Empire was a formidable adversary. Feared for its cavalry and political cunning, Crassus believed conquest would be swift, riches would multiply, and Rome's eastern frontier would expand under his name. But the Senate never officially sanctioned his campaign. This was not a war of necessity, it was a war of vanity. Crassus marched eastward with approximately 7 legions, totaling around 40,000 infantry, along with several thousand cavalry and auxiliary troops. He crossed the Euphrates in 53 BCE without resistance. Some advised caution, including the Armenian king Artaxerxes II, who urged Crassus to invade through Armenia, where mountainous terrain would negate the strength of the Parthian cavalry. Crassus, however, rejected the advice. He wanted a direct route, a swift victory, and most importantly, glory earned on Roman terms. This desire for personal honor and glory at all costs clouded his judgment, leading him down a path that would soon prove disastrous. Plutarch, the moralist historian of the 1st century CE, later wrote that Crassus was driven less by a thirst for glory than by an insatiable hunger for wealth, so much so that he believed no one should be called rich unless he could pay for an army. Crassus's army plunged deeper into Mesopotamia, underestimating the enemy and overestimating Roman invincibility. What followed would become one of the greatest humiliations in Rome's long military history, one from which Crassus would never return. The fate of the Roman Empire's pride would be sealed on the dusty plains of Carrhae. The winds of the Mesopotamian plains carried with them no warnings, only dust, silence, and the fate of an empire's pride. Crassus and his legions marched eastward, confident in Roman arms, dismissive of any threat the Parthians could pose. After all, they were barbarians, or so many in Rome believed. But the Parthian Empire was no tribal backwater. It was a disciplined and formidable power. Its military might rested in the precision of horse archers and the thunderous charge of cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry who would soon carve their legacy into Roman memory. The Parthians had perfected the art of cavalry warfare, and their ability to engage from a distance was unmatched by any force in the Roman world. The two armies met near the small town of Carrhae, known today as Harran. In modern southeastern Turkey around May of 53 BCE, Crassus, ignoring the advice of his generals and local allies, ranged his army in a square formation on the open plain, a structure ill-suited to counter fast-moving cavalry. The Romans, despite their formidable discipline and organization, were not prepared for the fluid, agile warfare that the Parthians excelled in. The Parthians began a relentless assault, not with direct confrontation, but with waves of arrows from their mounted archers. They harassed the Roman ranks with their arrows, never allowing the Romans a stationary target to strike at. The Roman heavy infantry, the backbone of Crassus's army, was left ineffective, forced to march against a moving enemy they could not reach. As the hours passed, the sun beat down relentlessly on the battlefield. Roman shields bristled with arrows, and the ground was littered with the wounded and dying. Every Roman advance was met by retreating archers. Every pause was punished with renewed volleys. The Roman legions, trained for battle in the traditional Roman style, were now utterly impotent. The Parthian cavalry was everywhere, launching arrows from every direction, striking from impossible angles. The Romans had no way of closing the distance. The battle became a slow, agonizing attrition. The Roman forces were not just losing, they were being broken down piece by piece, morale shattered under the constant barrage. One Roman officer, Publius Licinius Crassus, Crassus's own son, led a charge to break the Parthian lines. He and his men were surrounded. Despite their efforts, they could not break through. After a fierce but hopeless fight, Publius took his own life to avoid capture. His head was severed and paraded before the Roman lines, a horrifying signal of total collapse. Plutarch records that when Crassus saw his son's head, he neither wept nor reacted as men do in grief, but stood silent, clutching his sword, as if stunned by fortune's cruelty. Crassus was left frozen in shock, not in the agony of loss, but in the disbelief that this was happening at all. His entire campaign, his life's ambition, was unraveling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The battle extended into a second day. Starved of water, morale, and leadership, the Romans faltered. Crassus attempted to negotiate a retreat, but his forces were scattered. The once proud Roman legions, so confident in their invincibility, were now reduced to a disorganized and broken mob. The Parthian cavalry, relentless in their pursuit, ensured there would be no safe retreat for the Romans. What was once a disciplined and well-equipped army was now a shattered remnant, and the Parthians pressed their advantage with deadly precision. The relentless assault continued, with Crassus's army suffering horrific casualties. Of the roughly 40,000 soldiers he had brought, over 20,000 were killed, and 10,000 were taken prisoner, one of the worst defeats in Roman history. The Parthians had not simply defeated the Romans, they had humiliated them. Crassus, a man once synonymous with wealth and power, was now a fugitive, his reputation destroyed on the battlefield. His pride, and that of Rome itself, lay in ruins on the plains of Carrhae. The Romans, who had long believed in their superiority over all other nations, were forced to face the bitter reality that they were not invincible. For Crassus, the disaster at Carrhae marked the end of his ambition. His entire life had been devoted to gaining wealth and power, but it was this very ambition that had led him to his doom. The man who had once been the richest in Rome, whose influence stretched across the empire, was now at the mercy of an enemy he had underestimated.
Right.
In the aftermath of the slaughter at Carrhae, what remained of Crassus's once mighty force? Shattered, leaderless, exhausted, and gripped by despair. The Roman dream of Eastern conquest had not only failed, it had disintegrated into chaos. As night fell over the desolate plains, Crassus, once Rome's wealthiest and most powerful financier, became a desperate man surrounded by foreign sand and hostile arrows. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of the fallen, both Roman and Parthian, the air thick with the stench of death. Crassus, the man who had commanded vast wealth and legions of soldiers, now faced the harsh reality of his failure. There would be no glory, no riches, only the bitter taste of defeat. The Parthian general Surenna, known for both his military brilliance and theatrical cruelty, offered terms. He proposed a truce and safe passage if Crassus would come in person to negotiate. The suggestion divided the surviving Roman officers. Some believed it a trap. Others, consumed by fear and eager for any hope of salvation, urged Crassus to accept. The man who had once controlled entire districts of Rome through sheer wealth now had no clear path forward. He was a man on the verge of total collapse, trapped by his own choices, unable to escape the consequences of his ambition. Reluctantly, Crassus agreed. He knew that there was little hope left for his men, and the thought of further bloodshed seemed futile. He was no longer the great general commanding legions. He was a man defeated, humbled by the weight of his own decisions. The meeting was set outside the town of Carrhae, near the Demise river. Crassus arrived with a small group of officers, hopeful yet fearful of what was to come. Surenna appeared in full ceremonial display, orned in royal silk, surrounded by an intimidating cavalry guard. The contrast between the two men could not have been more stark. Surenna, a conqueror in his own right, was calm and composed, a symbol of the Parthian Empire's strength. Crassus, once a giant in the Roman world, was now a shadow of his former self, humbled by the events that had unfolded. Plutarch records that the Parthians feigned civility at first, offering food and drink, insisting the treaty be sealed by a traditional procession on horseback. The Parthians were masters of psychological warfare, and their show of courtesy only added to the tension in the air. Crassus, however, was wary. He had lived a life of deception and manipulation, and he knew that nothing was as it seemed. As the two sides mounted their horses, the tension began to escalate. What started as a negotiation soon turned into chaos. Accounts tell us that a skirmish broke out. Some say it was a deliberate ploy by the Parthians. Others claim it was a misunderstanding between the two sides. Regardless, the outcome was the same. Crassus was seized by Parthian troops, and his guards were slaughtered. The richest man in Rome was now a prisoner. The fate of Crassus was sealed. But what followed would become one of the most infamous punishments in ancient history. Surenna, well aware of Crassus's obsession with wealth, devised a death that would transform his greed into poetic justice. In a grotesque act of mockery, Surenna ordered molten gold to be poured into Crassus's mouth. The symbolism was clear. Crassus, the man who had sought to buy power with his wealth, would now be destroyed by the very gold he had once held so dear. His captors restrained him and forced open his mouth. Then, in a symbolic act of cruelty, molten gold was poured in, turning his legendary greed into a fatal irony. Ancient sources describe the moment as both theatrical and brutal, carried out in silence as a grim message to Rome. It was not just an execution, it was a message. A statement to Rome that Parthia would not be bullied, that gold could not buy victory, and that arrogance had a price. Crassus, who had believed that wealth could protect him, was now facing the ultimate price for his hubris. His death was a powerful reminder that no amount of gold or power could shield a man from the consequences of his actions. His head and hands were later sent to the Parthian court, where they were used in theatrical performances, mocked before royal audiences as symbols of Rome's defeat. Some sources suggest Crassus's head was even delivered to the Armenian king Artavasdes II, used in a Greek tragedy performed for the Parthian king Orodes II, who was celebrating the marriage of his son.
Ow.
Though some Roman sources dispute whether molten gold was actually used or if the tale was embellished, the act remains deeply recorded in ancient literature. Even the Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing more cautiously, notes that Crassus was slain, and his head sent to the king, with tales of his fate spread as a warning. The symbolic weight of Crassus's death endured far beyond the battlefield. His downfall was not merely the loss of a man, but the collapse of Roman arrogance before a world it thought beneath it. Crassus had gambled his legacy on conquest, but found only ruin. He chased glory and gold, and was silenced by both. Crassus's at Carrhae was more than the fall of a man. It was the collapse of Roman arrogance before a world it thought beneath it. His ambition reshaped the eastern frontier, provoked decades of Roman-Parthian rivalry, and showed that wealth and pride are no match for terrain, tactics, and fate. It reminds us that history punishes those who ignore its limits. Rome had underestimated the Parthians, and what did it cost them? It cost them more than lives. It cost them their pride, their sense of invincibility, and their confidence in their power. As Cassius Dio wrote, and the Parthians, as some say, poured molten gold into his mouth in mockery. For though a man of vast wealth, he had set so great store by money as to pity those who could not support an enrolled legion from their own means, regarding them as poor men.